Hello and welcome back to the Cozy Design Studio. My name is Nick and I'm so glad you're here. Today we're going to be taking a look at a concerning pattern I've noticed in gaming that has been going on for quite some time, which I think might be counterproductive to what we all want for the future of games. But real quick before we get into that, if you like this video and you want more like it, make sure you like, subscribe, and ring the bell so YouTube knows that you like my stuff. But now with that out of the way, let's get into the video, shall we? Okay, I know a lot of you are probably rolling your eyes at the screen already, but don't click off just yet. I'm not just going to sit here and complain about modern gaming and reminisce about the good old days. I promise I have something a bit more cogent to say than that. I've been noticing over the years that I've been involved in gaming a bit of a concerning trend among gaming discourse, which, if we can come to grips with, might shed some light on why it seems every game that releases recently is either an absolute hit, which blows up the gaming world, or a total flop, which no one ever talks about again. Let's start with the elephant in the room. Games are products. Gaming is a commercial industry. On the whole, when we talk about gaming and games as art, we aren't so much talking about that one awesome game that you played on itch.io that some person made in their spare time that you can play for totally free on the internet. In general, we're talking about medium to big budget games, which are looking for a source of profit. Ideally, they're able to find that profit by simply making a great game, which the general public adores and showers with purchases. That's the ideal scenario, the rosy picture of a healthy gaming economy. The company that funded it gets their money, the creative minds behind it get their credit and a fair paycheck, and the adoring fans get their wonderful artwork which they can play alone or with friends and have all kinds of amazing experiences with. And once in a blue moon, that might happen. However, the vast majority of the time, that is incredibly far from reality. The majority of the time, a game will be announced, there will be a whole hype cycle it will release, and for maybe a week or two, the gaming world at large will talk about nothing other than just how amazing this game is and how much they love it. They create memes around it and in-jokes and all kinds of fun cultural development. But then, after a bit of time, the game just kind of fades back into the background of gaming. Sure, it may have secured its place in the Gaming Hall of Fame, but ultimately, people move on and start to go search for the next big hit to give them the same feeling that the last one did. A trend in a non-statistical scenario is a short-lived, superficially popular product, a flash in the pan. People buy it because it's popular and because their favorite people have it or talk up how desirable it is. In essence, it's something that is popular not on its own merits, not on how good the product is, but something which derives its value from the opinions of influential people in your life. Now, you'll notice nowhere in that concept of trend does it actually say that the product in question has no actual merits. It's more of a description of the customer's relationship to the product. So when I say something is a trend in this video, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value or isn't well made or doesn't have some legitimate reason to be desirable. All it means is that people aren't interacting with it because of that value, but instead for a much more superficial reason. A popular example I'm sure you're very well aware of is Labubus, and really blind boxes in general. Of course, I'm sure you watching this video have a very good, well thought out reason that you spent over $100 trying to get that one rare figurine that you still haven't quite managed to snag. But I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that most people aren't buying things like Labubus because they actually like the way they look or because they see some kind of personal representation in the art of the designs being made. Instead, I think most people who are getting excited about this particular trend are that way because the people they look up to online or even in person are jumping onto the trend. And I want to say I don't actually think there's anything inherently wrong with that. Most people don't come to trivial purchasing decisions based on pure reason and rationality, and I wouldn't even argue that they should. Social popularity and trendiness serves as a pretty useful heuristic. If everyone in your social group likes a thing, it's probably fairly likely you'll like it too. After all, people tend to gravitate towards other people who have similar values to themselves, so it's not too crazy to think that if the other people in your group found it a worthwhile purchase, that you might find some value in it as well. However, when things become trendy, they also start to carry with them a bit of an air of exclusivity, and that heuristic can be used in reverse just as easily. If someone doesn't have that thing, that means they probably don't have the same values as you, and therefore you shouldn't interact with them. They're in the out group. Now, I hope I don't have to explain why that's not exactly an ideal scenario. In the first case, the stakes are pretty low. Simply using this heuristic to decide if you want to spend $40 on some doll doesn't really have much in the way of negative outcomes. The worst case scenario is that you hate the doll and you're out $40. In reverse, though, it can become far more damaging. There is, at the very least, an argument to be made for the validity of the first scenario, but the second? That's full of logical fallacies. And nothing about one thing that a person owns can actually tell you about what kind of person they are. But it's just such an easy and natural conclusion to come to. Our brains are kind of wired to do this kind of thing, and while we might know that it's irrational, there's still that gut feeling that when you see someone that you share something in common with, that you probably share other things in common as well. Other, more important things. So how does this all interact with gaming? Well, as with most forms of media, games make most of their money from the initial release, and the success of that initial release is very much affected by the hype around the game. And in most cases, when a game explodes onto the gaming scene, it's because of the social excitement around the game. Now, like I said, just because the initial excitement and enthusiasm for the game is mostly driven by hype and the trend cycle, that doesn't mean that these games are necessarily low quality. I think of Helldivers 2 in particular. It's a good game, great even, but I don't think that was really the driving force behind its popularity when it released. From the outside, as someone who never played the game outside of a single match on my friend's PlayStation 5, the game was mostly attractive not because of the game itself, but because of the culture around it, the pseudo-social movement around the game's controversies, and the devs' unusual level of interaction with the players. It felt like buying the game was almost a political vote in favor of great games done well, and not a purchasing decision between it and any other game on the store. And to be clear, I'm not trying to come off as above this all myself. I fall into this all the time, and it's not even something I would say people should feel bad about. But I do think it's something that is worth thinking about because it influences our purchasing decisions more than we might like to think. Most people, if you asked them, would say that games are priced far too high, and these companies that make them are crazy to ask as much as they do. That's not exactly a hot take. Most gamers would probably agree. And I'm not going to get into a discussion about inflation and the fact that games have stayed largely the same price for decades because I know very little, if anything, about the economical principles that I would need to actually talk about that. Regardless of all of that, though, on the whole, most gamers would agree that games cost too much, and they can't afford to keep spending $60 to $80 on a game whenever a new one comes out. And that's fair. I'm in the same boat, but is that really an accurate complaint? Do games really cost $60 to $80? Or is that just more of a social tax? Whenever you hear somebody on the internet talk about the price of games being too high, you'll probably hear them say something to the effect of, "It's ridiculous to ask gamers to pay $80 to play a game at launch. The game's only X hours long and the graphics aren't even that good, etc., etc." And the interesting thing I always notice people doing is adding that at launch qualifier. What they're communicating is that they don't like having to pay $80 to play a game when everybody else is playing it, when that hype cycle is at its most attractive. And I mean, fair. A lot of the value of these games comes from the wider social discussion and culture around them at launch. So if you hop on later, then you're really only interacting with the actual mechanics of the game and not the more nebulous social aspect. Let's bring it back to cozy games. Animal Crossing is a great example of this. Sure, the game itself is really good. I loved playing it, but it was at its most appealing right around the pandemic. And that is because a lot of what drew people to that game came from the culture around it. People sharing designs, visiting each other's islands, and any number of creators online creating tons of content around the game. If you played during that time, you'll know the joy of being part of that explosion, and that culture. It felt great. It did a lot to enshrine that game in the annals of cozy gaming history. More than almost any other cozy game before or after, it was able to capitalize on people's desire for social interaction and community. And that ensured that if you met someone who had Animal Crossing out in the wild, maybe in class or at work or just in an online chat room, you could instantly strike up a conversation about the game and start to build a connection based on this game. But if you've played it recently, that community isn't nearly as strong as it used to be. It's not the cultural conversation anymore. Sure, you can still visit other people's islands and download cool custom designs, but you don't see things like cool Doom crossovers, museums digitizing their artwork into codes you can own in-game totally for free, or nearly the news coverage that it got back in the beginning. Instead, you basically just interact with the game itself, its mechanics, and all its flaws. And that's not to say that it's a bad game. It's not. I loved it, and I still love it. But it has lost a good portion of its appeal, an appeal which was largely driven by the social movement around it, and not so much by the game itself. It was more about what owning and playing the game said about you than it was about the game itself. So when people say they don't like having to pay $80 to play a game at launch, they aren't saying someone is holding a gun to their head and making them buy the game. They know they don't have to buy the game, but they're expressing their discontent with the fact that it feels like if you buy a game at launch, you're being taxed for wanting to interact with the social movement around it. And like we talked about, the people in the in-group will be making all kinds of jokes and memes and participating in the movement, and you'll just be on the outside not really understanding any of it because you didn't play the game in time. And then when you finally do get around to playing it, and you can participate in the memes and all of that stuff, everyone else will have moved on to a new thing, which you can't afford to buy. And so the cycle continues. And there are countless examples of this. It's not just limited to big budget games like Helldivers or Animal Crossing. I actually feel like I see it happen almost more often in the indie space. Games like Peak or Power Wash Sim or Lethal Company, if you're not part of that first wave, it feels like you missed some of what it is that these other people liked so much about those games. And I think it probably happens more with indie games because there's a bit of a, hidden gem feeling when you find an indie that's not super popular yet, and that helps drive communities around those games. Plus the fact that indie gamers really like to tout the outstanding quality that you can get from their favorite games when compared to big, expensive AAA games. Also, and I'm just thinking about this now, with indie games, like the ones that I mentioned, a lot of them are multiplayer based, and so finding a group of people to play with is going to be a lot more difficult if the game has already kind of died down in the eyes of the internet at large. And so it kind of loses some of its vibrance if you don't have people to play the game with when the game is designed around cooperative play. So that's probably part of the reason why you kind of see this a little bit more with indie games as opposed to giant AAA games, because giant AAA games are pretty much, if people like them, they're going to have a pretty solid base of people online playing the game pretty much all the time, so that's not really going to be as big of an issue. All of that is to say, I understand the desire to be part of that first wave, and I do think there is something special about being able to take part in that. But I think it's been affecting the way that we play games and the way that we interact with the art contained in them. I think this is having a fairly negative effect on how we kind of digest games. And I really don't want to come across like I'm saying, in the good old days, things were better. Because I don't think that that's true, and I do think games have developed and evolved a lot since the good old days. But I think there is a bit of value that we lose by having such ready access to all of these games. You don't have to go far on the internet to hear people talking about how back when they were kids, how they would get only one game a year or something, and they would basically just play that game all the time. And I think there is a certain value to that kind of restriction that we lose when games become this trendy product. And I don't know, maybe it's an inevitable development with the way that the world is going and how marketing has evolved, and I'm far from someone who thinks social media is like the scourge from hell, but I do think it's had a fairly detrimental effect on how people view products. And then, especially with now short-form media, everything has to be easily digestible, it has to grab your attention right away, and I think that leads people, marketers, whoever it is, to lean more on those flawed heuristics like the ones that we talked about earlier. And if we think about games in that way, and value them more for the social clout that we get from playing them and being part of the discussion, I worry that it devalues not only the many games which aren't in the hype cycle, but also the games that are. The lasting value of these games is diminished by the fact that people feel the need to just move on to the next game all the time. And to be clear, I'm not trying to be alarmist. I don't think that we're seeing like the end of video games. There are tons of people who will still absolutely spend hundreds or even thousands of hours with just one game. And small indie games, I think, are thriving now more than they ever have. So I don't want you to think that this is me saying that this is some kind of existential issue that we need to feel bad for taking part in. And ultimately, these are video games. It's really not that deep. But as someone who is very passionate about games and who loves this world and community, it's something that does kind of concern me. Not in any existential way, but just in like a kind of gut reaction kind of way, you know? I guess my point with all of this is just to be aware of what is driving your purchasing decisions. Are you buying that game because it's a great game, or are you buying it because it's the popular game right now? There's no right answer, but I do think that it's just the simple act of thinking about why you're buying it and the reasoning behind that. I do think that that's important so that you don't make decisions based solely off of gut reactions and primal emotions. And again, I want to be clear, I don't want this to come off like I'm preaching from my high tower. I find myself doing this all the time, so I guess more than me really having a solid black and white moralistic conclusion, I just want to know what all of you think. Do you think that this is bad for gaming as a whole, or is it a natural consequence of gaming becoming more and more mainstream? Is it an inevitability that should be embraced, or a potential omen for the death of gaming as we once knew it? Probably not that last one, but leave your comments down below. I personally tend to be more on the optimistic side, so I really don't think that this is something that's going to like spell the end of gaming, and I think there will always be games and developers who make well thought out, deep, introspective, single-player experiences which don't get the mainstream attention they maybe should. So I guess I think that this is something we should be aware of, but maybe don't lose too much sleep over it. But I don't know, I'm just a guy in his room thinking far too much about video games. So let me know what you think down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a video. If you like what I make, you can join the channel. I would really appreciate the support. But if you can't afford that, or you just don't want to, you just being here is far more than I could ever ask for. So with that, I'll just say thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, happy gaming.